Welcome to VidZet. I'm Dr. Ted Noel. With Hillary Clinton's defeat, our focus on her Parkinson's disease must move to other subjects. After all, our future no longer involves her participation. We'll talk about that in our next video. With the number of people newly subscribing to VidZet, I can't just sign off. So, after reading your suggestions, VidZet will continue by exploring the conflict between government and your health. And that's a target-rich environment. Before we dig in, we have to build a foundation that helps us to understand two groups. Those are bureaucrats and professional politicians. We simply cannot tackle the problems that the government creates without a better understanding of the laws of the bureaucrat. Now, when Congress passes a law, it adds language that the appropriate agency shall adopt rules to implement the law. These regulations will be written by bureaucrats and have the force of law. There is a very large constitutional argument that this is illegal, since only Congress has the power to create law. But they do it anyway. And as the expression goes, there's the rub. Bureaucrats have exactly the same incentives that you and I do. They want a secure job and they want attaboys. Their very existence depends on the need that the law was written to answer. And this is the big problem. We'll use examples from the Environmental Protection Agency to help paint the picture. Law number 1. There must be a problem that only the bureaucrat, the smartest person around, can solve. Because Congress passed the law, the issue has to be important. And because the bureaucrat gets to implement the law, he is by definition the smartest person around. After all, if Congress is as smart as he was, they would have written the solution into the law. Instead, they left it to him. Now, if we had solved the problem, there would be no need for him to fix our mess. Remember, reality does not need to intrude here. Now, let's get real for a minute. The reality of the need is not determined by the presence of the statute. Rather, the statute reflects the perception of need. For example, if people are dying of drug overdoses, it must mean that there is something we can fix with a new drug law. The possibility that existing laws are the problem is never considered. In the case of the EPA, there appeared to be a real problem. In 1970, air and water quality in many places were polluted, and it looked like a federal agency was needed. And that brings us to law number 2. The bureaucrat can never actually solve the problem. You say, wait a minute, why would that be the case? He's there to solve the problem, shouldn't he do the job? No. Because the bureaucrat needs a problem to exist. Solving the problem gets rid of the need for him to be. It gets rid of his job. That means the bureaucrat must never actually solve the problem. In the case of the EPA, smokestack regulations and automobile exhaust rules largely fixed air quality. Policing factories that dump toxic chemicals into streams cleaned most of them up. The problem was fixed. And that brings us to the corollary, that if by some great misfortune a bureaucrat actually solved the problem, there'd be no reason for him. So at that point, it is imperative for the bureaucrat to identify a new problem, which only he is able to solve. So the EPA started regulating particulate matter in the air that doesn't even cause problems. And when the navigable waters were cleaned up, the EPA created a new definition of navigable waters that allowed them to regulate a farmer's pond. A bureaucrat doesn't need to solve a problem before he identifies a new one. Don't get me wrong here. He can find another one. Once he gets a little free time, his exceptional abilities will discover another task by which he can serve others. This is how mission creep develops. Now, the bureaucrat can never be wrong, and he is above mere mortal humanity. Bureaucrats constantly seek to aggregate greater and greater authorities to themselves as a result. This shows how superior they are. Bureaucracy will necessarily become our masters then, rather than our servants. Let me say this again. Unless we blow up a bureaucracy from time to time, it will become so large and intrusive that it will rule over us. And that brings us to law number 3. Every problem can be solved with a rule. Now, you and I know that isn't true, but that's the law of the bureaucrat. It's imperative that the bureaucrat be able to measure how well things are going. This allows him to present his great success to his superiors, the press, and anyone else who will listen. But the only metric that can be presented without contradiction is a clear compliance or non-compliance with bright line rules. In other words, did you check the box or did you not? In the private sector, managers have to determine what the most reasonable course of action might be. But these judgment calls would make it impossible for the bureaucrat to determine whether the perfect course of action he decreed is actually being followed. Thus, only yes, no options can be allowed. Of course, if you are not following the bureaucrat's wise path, it's easy for him to tell an administrative law judge that you are non-compliant. And if there are multiple rules with conflicting mandates, then the bureaucrat has an even easier job. Everyone is a lawbreaker. If you don't do what he wants, there's always a crime he can charge you with. And that brings us to rule number 4. You didn't follow the rules. Now you can see how bureaucracies become entrenched and unwieldy. Every incentive is rigged for them to aggregate power, and they have no incentive whatever to actually serve the public. When I worked as a NASA contractor during the 1970s, we had a saying that any government agency that has been in existence for 5 years can justify its continued existence in perpetuity simply by refluxing paper. In layman's terms, once the sign is on the building, they will bury you in paper, and there isn't a damn thing you can do about it. As we proceed in this series, we'll see many examples of how the laws of the bureaucrat control how government interacts with medicine. So that you will have access to the laws as a reference, they will be posted in print form on the website. Now, reforming bureaucracies is probably a fool's errand. Legislative dynamite is probably the only thing that will work. Let's pick one example. To undo the continuing student loan debt disaster created by the Department of Education, the best first move is probably to simply legislate the Department of Education out of existence. If some small kernel of it is so important that we must keep it, then it can be reauthorized. But we ought to err on the side of destruction, not creation. As Ronald Reagan said, the 10 worst words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you." I'm Dr. Ted Noel. Thanks for watching.